Hi, I'm Laura Hoptman. I'm from the Museum of Modern Art, and my friend and colleague Michelle has allowed me to usurp her introductory message to do it myself. I'm happy to introduce my two colleagues and friends, Nancy Spector, the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Brooklyn Museum, and Tim Griffin, the Executive Director of the Kitchen. What to paint really recalls a revolutionary cry, right? What is to be done? And for us, for our parts in our discussions, the larger issue at hand, maybe at this symposium, is what Cai has called artistic values, which I read as no less than the purpose of art, whether it's defined by the skill or the intention of the artist, or the goal of the institution that exhibits it. We have two exhibition makers who are leading time-honored organizations for this panel, the Brooklyn Museum and the Kitchen. Both are very different in terms of scale and of mission, but the two organizations share a deep commitment to building relationships within their artistic communities and also beyond them. Both Nancy and Tim's briefs in their jobs include honoring and utilizing the history of their institutions while at the same time re-envisioning their programming for the era of now. So we're going to begin this discussion with a given. That is, an artwork or an exhibition or an institution can be or create a situation that can be relevant to life as we experience it. That is, say, outside of the bird cage of the art world. Nancy will speak to us, actually, Tim will speak to us first about the organization of institutions in dialogue and reaction to historical moments, modes of productions, issue of leisure and work, and positioning of the viewer. He'll use the kitchen as a case history, as it is an institution dedicated to the notion of interdisciplinarity in the arts and is born from the idealism of the great society whose cultural largesse was the impetus for the creation of not-for-profits all over the country, the kitchen being a banner, not-for-profit. Nancy will speak to us about how the great Brooklyn Museum, an encyclopedic museum, has conceived of the idea of, quote, socially relevant, the notion of a socially relevant museum. And after their presentations, we'll have a conversation up here, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So, Tim? So, Nancy? Can I sit here? Where do I sit?
Hi, we're disrupting things already. So, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you to the Asian Society for the invitation, to Michelle Yun for so effectively organizing all of our time and getting here. And to Cai, I realized sitting here that we have an anniversary as well. It was 20 years ago that we met in 1996 for the first Hugo Boss Prize. I remember coming to see you at the clock tower. Was it the clock tower? For the little crabs in the sand, which I didn't see up here, and then had the opportunity and the great fortune to witness your amazing exhibition at the museum with Alexander Monroe and Tom Krenz, the commission exhibition in Berlin. So I feel like our trajectories have been intertwined for a very long time. So it's very nice to be here. So thank you. I took a little detour on the subject today, the question about what about art. And given that I'm now only 5 months into the Brooklyn Museum, the burning question for me is, what about the museum? And what can I do in the context of such a venerable institution with such an amazing history that could, in the end, make a difference in some way? And it's something that I'm actually, at this point, quite obsessed with. The questions I've been asking myself is, how can a museum, of course, be a conduit for creativity? We make exhibitions. In a very traditional sense, we make exhibitions, as all museums. In some cases, we are stewards for enormous collections, and that's a huge responsibility. But how, in the end, can a museum define itself? And be defined. And this is not really a typical branding exercise in the sense of coming up with the great logo and the tagline, although believe me, that's going on as well. But in the end, what is it that we're known for, but what is it that we do? And again, we make exhibitions, we do things that are traditionally assigned to the concept of the museum. But I want to take that further, and I'm also speaking on behalf of my new director, Ann Pasternak, who is a kind of trailblazer in thinking about these things, what she did at Creative Time. And it's a lot of this, it's the substance of what we're really thinking about is, how does a museum make a difference? What can a museum actually stand for? So, of course, representation and display of art, supporting artists, nurturing creativity, it's in the ethos of museums, but we're trying to take it a little bit further, and what, in the end, do we stand for? And I think Cai actually, in his slides, said, in passing, about socially conscious art. And a lot of us are thinking about that these days, but how can a museum be socially conscious without sacrificing the critical and essential attention to the art? We don't want to usurp the work of artists. We don't want to displace it in any way. And it's a fine calibration. That's something we're thinking about a great deal, and I'm not saying that we've done it yet. And again, I'm at the beginning of my tenure. But I did want to share with you very quickly something that we're launching, and it's our anniversary. Let me just figure out what forward is here. No. Okay. Sorry, what did I do? Okay. Is this it? Yes. We're launching, in October, it begins the 10th anniversary of the Elizabeth Sackler Feminist Center for Art. And it has been an integral part of the museum, but it's been a kind of isolated, very creative fulcrum of all kinds of exhibitions that have resuscitated women artists, expanded the canon, and really important work. But this is a museum takeover. It's how do we use feminism as a lever to think beyond the original issues of gender parity to broader issues of social justice and tolerance and diversity and all of the things that the Brooklyn Museum has stood for under the great leadership of Arnold Lehman. But Anne and I are thinking, how can we now take it to the next level? So the title, Year of Yes, for those of you who have read Shonda Rhimes' kind of amazing book, which is very personal, a testament to her own travels through the amazing intersectional work that she does in popular culture. And we chose it because it's about affirmation. And feminism has so often been, and sadly, connected with a position of negativity, of standing against the patriarchy, against men, where we're really looking at it again as this notion of aspiration, of it being aspirational, and this notion, it goes back, and this is not a plug, but Hillary Clinton's very famous speech in China, in Beijing, saying human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. We take that very seriously in the work that we're doing right now. So this notion of an anniversary and programming and how one can weave together a coherent program across 12 months in all aspects of our programming. And then the museum really becomes, in a way, very creative. And again, it's a fine balance between usurping certain artists' work for a grand theme, which we also want to be careful of, but at the same time, how do we advance this program? So there's 10 exhibitions, 11 collections. They're not all involved, public programming, and I'm just going to quickly run through. I have to show you this. Beverly Buchanan, an African-American artist working in the South in the 70s. This is a canon expanding. Most people don't. I certainly didn't know her work. Working alongside of artists associated with post-minimalism. She's appropriating and thinking about Southern vernacular architecture and making actually land art. Quite meaningful work. Opens on October 21st. Marilyn Minter, beloved local artist who has, this is a traveling show that's coming to us, and a lot of what I did in my first month there was really trying to connect the dots for a number of programs that were in place. But again, how does this feed into this larger theme? And Marilyn Minter, who has really interrogated our commercial vocabulary around glamour and advertising. This is an interesting, probably outlier. Jeremy Deller, the Turner Prize-winning British conceptual artist, has staged a performative project in which he invited Iggy Pop, the rock star, to pose in a life drawing class. And that's already happened. So this exhibition will be the drawings. They were all amateur local artists who were selected by Iggy and Jeremy Deller, along with objects that Jeremy selected from the collection that look at the male nude. So this becomes this notion of the expanded look at how gender is represented, and it is both a collection show, a performative presentation. Infinite Blue was my attempt to try to figure out how do we bring the collections out into the open and infuse them with life, but also show what a number of us there think has happened is a kind of sacrifice of aesthetics to the overall arching narrative themes that are greatly important. So my charge to the curators is how to make something ravishingly beautiful, deeply scholarly, and utterly convincing. So it's using blue as a connective thread, looking across ancient Egypt to the present, and blue has so many valences that can be used from trade, materiality, spiritualism, nature, gender, of course, politics, blue and red. So this will fill the whole ground floor. Ancient Egypt, very quickly looking at new scholarship in Egyptology of how women, in order to get to the afterlife, needed to be transformed symbolically into a male figure as it was represented in ancient Egyptian religion. So there were pronoun shifts, color shifts. That's only been understood now. Until recently, people thought they were literally typos in the hieroglyphics, he for she. So this is a new discovery. This is out of the Egyptian collection. Georgia O'Keeffe, of course, we all know so well. This is a very new look at her work of how she crafted her own persona, how she styled herself, her clothing, which she left to her estate, how she art directed the portraits of her. She's not a passive sitter in her portraits by Stieglitz and right up through Annie Leibovitz. So her paintings will be shown with her clothing and photography portraits. Utopia Station, some of you may have remembered from the Venice Biennale in 2003. This is, again, a kind of expanded notion of feminism. I think we have to think about the future of our planet. And I invited Rick Ratir, Venetia, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, and Molly Nesbitt, the original curators, to think about what does it mean to talk about utopia. So much has changed since 2003. The crises have deepened. And this was a way, too, for me as a new member of the museum to really open it up. There'll be lots of artists, lots of thinkers, designers, architects, musicians, performers. And this is, there's no closing date, so this may never stop. I don't know, we're kind of letting it evolve throughout the museum. We Wanted a Revolution is a show that has been in the works for some time, unprecedented, looking at African-American women artists during the 1960s and 70s who really had to, in their own work, speak about race. There was so much within the women's movement about gender, but race was something that was not in mainstream feminism, second wave feminism, really addressed. And this is a kind of correction to that. The Dinner Party, of course, has launched all of this, and this looks at Judy Chicago's thinking process as coming to that, and we found out recently that the collection itself was very inspirational for her, so she'll be mining the collection as part of the show. And A Feminist Timeline, which is a very self-reflective analysis of the history of the Brooklyn Museum and the various radical gestures. It was the first museum to have what they called a community gallery in order to show work by our African-American artists in Brooklyn, and this was in the 1960s, little-known history, which we are kind of course, it wasn't under the imprimatur of feminism at that point, but we want to claim it in a very honest way. So this is a full year of activities, lots of public programs. We're launching something called the Dinner Party Series, from which we're inviting thought leaders from various fields to talk to us about what are the issues, not in the art world, but in the extended world that we must face. And our question is, can a museum actually make a difference? We can talk about it, we can represent it, but can we, with all of these thought leaders from journalism, government, people from NGOs, tech, science, Can we pick a few topics to then address in a conference that we're going to do in March? Can we find a topic that we could address and even think, is it possible to influence legislation? Is it possible to open the dialogue? Can we do that as a nonprofit? And these are the kinds of conversations that we're having. It's so exciting. We don't know where it's going. But when we say, what about the museum? I mean, that's my question is, how can a museum be socially relevant, meaningful, and, to make a difference? Final footnote and part of my inspiration for Blue was Anne Hamilton's piece in Charleston, the Indigo, this pile, I don't forget the title, Indigo Blue. Mounds of work shirts, denim. And it's the whole connection between labor, plantation. Of course, this was in Charleston. So we have a whole section on indigo. So I'm going to call you from Felix Gonzalez Torres's famous billboard that's never been seen in the United States to hopefully some dialogue with you to when indigo was invented, which I can't remember right now, but it was in the East, and the associations here are quite different. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
I am entering the league of the technologically challenged. All right, I think I found play. Is that? We're good. Okay. I'm going to go back. You can pretend you didn't see that. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of today's event. It's truly an honor and humbling to be among these amazing speakers and artists. And on the occasion, in retrospect, of a remarkable exhibition. I'm going to be making just a few remarks toward a discussion which I hope you'll receive as necessarily being more evocative than anything else, partly out of time constraints and partly because they do open onto some of the issues that we've already, or have already been cited. With Cai, I have to say, the way in which you'd continually point to a sort of space-time conduit, the importance of activating histories around works, histories around spaces, and then in conversation, the way in which it's important to sustain differences among those histories and architectures is incredibly salient. So when I was asked to join a conversation around art's reception around its, or with respect to its social or popular context or politic, two anecdotes immediately came to mind. I'll thank you in advance for allowing me a little bit of license, because I will return to the kitchen. The first is on its face relatively far afield in terms of what occurred to me, which is a kind of false dichotomy in American poetry. I'm sure you're all very familiar with American poetry. From the 1970s to today, mostly along the lines of a West Coast, East Coast divide. And the former, West Coast, is historically indebted to language poetry, and by extension, a kind of structuralism, the notion that syntax generates the terms for meaning. To go back to the discussion here earlier, that I or we, determined by our languages, and said that the poetry happens in the parsing of that language, and it's the task of poetry to do that so that we can better understand the terms for expression and the kind of subjectivity that, as much as we inhabit, we also receive. And the former, New York school, where I sort of hail from, is steeped in more of a authentic bohemian expressivity. It's not. It's more complex than this. Like I said, I'm allowing myself a little license. The record of a coherent individual who determines his or her own meaning and counterpoint with large or mass culture, and the self-expression has a kind of self-determined authenticity. Again, a caricature, but for the sake of illustration. So I say false dichotomy, as the reception of these camps more recently have changed in just among contemporary audiences, as made clear, for example, by reconsiderations of Frank O'Hara, a New York school poet, who came of age among the expressionists with that sense of authenticity and the importance of immediacy, and yet would delve into popular culture as well, often writing about Coca-Cola and jujubes. Pop and mass culture is now, at least among a certain set, receiving his writing, to offer a kind of material to subjectivity. It offers subjectivity a way to inhabit form. Each one is sort of a cast, impressing itself on another. And so, for example, when Frank O'Hara would write a poem called In Memory of My Feelings, citing a line, my quiet has a man in it. He has several likenesses which are received. So Jasper Johns would, as a contemporary and somebody who even collaborated with him, and the quality of that image once again speaks to my technological prowess, would change the status, change the relationship with the emotion, change the relationship with the expressive subject, change the relationship between the artist and the gesture. The gesture itself can be taken out of context. It can be used as a kind of object in its own right. And this ends up becoming one thread, one historical background for the kind of thing that happens in a place like the kitchen. What happens when performance shows up in a gallery, when it assumes a different kind of representational state? How does that correspond with larger developments in culture in terms of how one orients oneself in an institutional space might well have correlations with how one orients oneself in a political space? And in fact, one very probably impacts the other very strongly. Just to wrap up this one portion, I'd point you to, for better or for worse in terms of an exhibition, Achim Hochdorfer's and David Joselitz's painting 2.0, with Achim more specifically taking up this idea of how that gesture, that expression, that immediacy has a slightly different context around it now and meaning. Second thought that came to mind, and among these is Jacqueline Humphreys, who's a great New York artist. Second thought that came to my mind was in the wake of Cai's remarkable essay for his exhibition, in which he talks about how Soviet art was forgotten by the West, or forgotten in the West, after the demise of the Soviet Union. And I have to agree that there is something yet to glean from the example of Sots art and the dilemma faced by its artists. As Boris Groys once wrote, the only true protest felt by people practicing Sots art, acknowledged by the majority of their peers, was to, quote, ignore the prevailing visual regime entirely and maintain a kind of modernist remove. To which one might ask, what are the potential benefits to assuming a greater intimacy with these larger visual regimes? This is Eric Bulatov from 1984. And with these sort of commercial spheres, with the political and commercial icons of one's day. And one could say that in the United States, the political icons are also commercial icons. For me, I must say, in a sort of more discursive context, that comparison came very much to mind when I was at Art Farm, where you'd have Tom Ford next to Michael Fried or Jacques Rancière next to Yves Saint Laurent. What does that mean? And so, closer to home, the question becomes, how do you handle institutionally a scenario like this? Politics in a subtler but perhaps more elementary register. And to arrive at my own understanding of the kitchen, I think it's worthwhile to put forward just a few propositions about art and culture now. Again, radically abbreviated, somewhat caricatured, but for the sake of discussion. Proposition. There are ties between the modes of production and of display in one's day. And art historically, you could look at Baxandal and ways of seeing, but so it is in the day of great exhibitions, one would look at the objects of industry. And when it comes to the duration of that experience, one could also think about how the Metropolitan Museum of Art was developed at roughly the same time as the arcades and was actually keyed to a certain amount of time that one spent there. Roughly 8 hours, in the new sort of mall structures is what one could expect of a viewer, a kind of viewer, who would walk through a Metropolitan Museum of Art space. Arguably, you could say that there's a shift among larger institutions now, and it's one that a nonprofit like the Kitchen needs to deal with as well. If there's a rise in the service economy, we're more apt to behold, say, performance. It becomes an idiom of one's day. And this was Let's Entertain at the Walker, which at that point was being directed by Kathy Hallbright, and this is a sort of remarkable thing to me, how the authors of this business book, The Experience Economy, were invited, because they were local, to the museum in order to speak and talk about how art inhabits this commercial sphere. And it is somewhat site-specific, as the Mall of America was down the street, effectively, as well. I think that was an inspired moment, if potentially troubling in some ways. I can't help but do this, but and there's that pixelation again. Tino Siegel, another fantastic artist, Nancy worked with, has, I think, been very mindful of this, even pointing to a book by Tony Bennett, in my estimation, with this exhibition, What is Progress? That sort of understanding that there's a different kind of temporality, there's a different kind of artistic production that is in dialogue with different economic structures today. That said, I do think that there are also shifts in scale, circulation, modes of attention that figures with this mode of the economy. And one asks, with the institutions that we have today that were created in other centuries and around different kinds of economies, a question does remain in terms, and I think it is like the latent or liminal subject in so many of the programs we deal with on every level, is who is the individual now? Who is the we, but who is the individual? Who and how is that individual being positioned and posited? So, About the Kitchen, it was created in 1971 originally as a center for video, but it was also something of a community center that eventually, and actually quite rapidly, after its beginnings in 1971, began to accommodate a number of disciplines in a loft culture setting. So, one, there was an immediate proximity with new technologies of the day. At the same time that it was completely juxtaposed, or it was enmeshed in this idea of how a more intimate kind of communication and dialogue across disciplines could happen. This is Tony Conrad, one of his first exhibitions, actually I think his first, in 1973 at the Kitchen, Yellow Paintings. And as you can see, it has a sort of loft-like scenario. Shortly after this, you might see a dance, or you might see Steve Reich performing new compositions. Shortly after that, actually this is a little bit later, maybe about 4 years after that, you would see Dara Birnbaum presenting video, and the space itself would be forming, reshaped in different constellations of work from week to week, literally. Now, what I do think is remarkable about this particular space is that there's a gallery that's immediately over a theater setting. So you can actually take the temporalities of one and put it in the other. You can have a sort of display scenario that is related to theater as part of an exhibition. And I think that sort of tension, that sort of ambiguity is, to me, it's the most interesting thing about organizations happening right now. And I do, again, think it's happening both large and small. But at this particular scale, maybe one has more immediate maneuverability. Just the history of the space, Sherry Levine also had an early exhibition there in Namjoon Pike. And Arthur Russell, I want to point to in terms of musician, again, dialoguing back maybe with the example of O'Hara, where you'll have somebody who's working in neoclassical avant-garde downtown music scene and meshing that with disco, and also collaborating with Allen Ginsberg at some point. So that, again, that sort of an understanding that there are ways to bring together these worlds that seem otherwise incongruous, while at the same time, and I do want to point this out, actually maybe I'll hold that off for a later, well actually, a place like the Kitchen, and I think in larger institutions, although I can stand corrected, are gravitating toward interdisciplinary forms that have roots in loft culture, and yet because loft culture no longer exists, one wonders exactly what is being presented. What is that? Is there a difference between presentation, representation? At the Kitchen, because it's community-based, it offers a particular kind of salience. This is Jan Vo, who was collaborating with Shu Shu. Here I'd point to the ways in which interdisciplinarity the way in which a single viewer walking through the space does not know necessarily how to orient herself or himself. I'm wrapping it up. Where you walk into the space and at one moment you say, okay, I'm watching a rock and roll performance. I know how to watch that, or a music performance. Wait a minute, now am I watching an art performance, or is the backdrop of that a little bit more, is this a display space? I think that sort of rich ambiguity, or even the possibility of occupying numerous positions at once in terms of the choreography of an exhibition space or performance space, has everything to do with the politics and even precariousness of political structures today. And then I'm going to go past this one nice installation and land with Ralph Lemon, who I think has been sort of getting as well as, if not better than most artists, at the crux of this particular constellation that's being put forward at the Kitchen, where in his recent exhibition Scaffold Room, he would have a theater space inside a theater space. So at the same time that he might have a lecture as part of a performance, and then upstairs in the gallery setting, he would have a relative survey of his own work, but the history, the sort of sequence of things becomes very ambiguous. How one thing led to another versus the idea of things being able to circulate through time in that sort of time-space channel. It becomes a subject of the work. Similarly, there's certain objects where you don't know whether to look at it in terms of an anthropological or ethnographic lens, or an aesthetic lens, or perhaps both. And finally, in something that I do think is key to his practice and key to the very notion of a place like the Kitchen today, in which offer stakes underlying the presentation of art today, is how, for his own sort of choreography, because he's both a choreographer and a visual artist, he'll point to Bruce Naumann's wall floor positions of 1968 and use that in his own choreography, at the same time as wanting to suggest that the very positioning of the viewer has everything to do with the politics of the day, in the same way that he would like to think about Naumann and the movements he made in the context of protest and even the assassination of Martin Luther King at that point. So what I want to say about the Kitchen, and what I think is perhaps relevant in terms of interdisciplinarity and organizations in this context, is how that notion of the mind and body, as it's being positioned or is in dialogue with an institutional space, is I think very much at the crux of the matter. And again, I think it's subtle and pervasive. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I think what I'd like to do is you guys maybe pose a question or two, and you could pose a question to one another, and then we're just going to open it up if anybody in the audience wants to join the conversation. Is that all right, Tim?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I have a question, but maybe I'm going to let you guys first. Would either of you like to start with a question, or do you want to go with mine? And mine is okay. We're going to go with mine. It's a broad one, and that is this: does an institution have a built-in? You talked about the notion of the built-in remove, a modernist remove. Does an institution, in fact, because it is an institution, have a built-in remove? And is this idea of open doors, and I mean that in theoretical terms as well as, I mean, in realpolitik terms, is that really just a vision and not a reality? Is it not possible really to reach the street, to bring the street into the institution and vice versa?
I think it's certainly a goal. I don't know yet. It's interesting. I wish Anne Pasternak were here because of all of her work with Creative Time, which is in the street, essentially. And it's something she's thinking about deeply, of how the Brooklyn Museum can infiltrate and communicate with the borough of Brooklyn So we'll see.
And what about the kitchen in its glory and insularity, in a way?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm talking about historical insularity.
Sure. No, I think something we both touched on, and which ends up being the most intriguing thing to me, is how one activates the history of a place. How one actually makes that context alive in real time. It offers a backdrop against which you can make projects make a different kind of sense, and then you begin to really enmesh it in the culture that's around it. In a practical way, and the kitchen is such a small organization, and in many ways that means that we're a little bit spoiled because you can invite people in easily. And on the other hand, it makes it and there can be a really intimate and substantive exchange that translates into a program relatively quickly. And on the other hand, what can be problematic is often nobody knows about it.
But can an institution as such make something relevant, bring something into the general discourse, or is it really about presenting relevant information that gets it into the general discourse? You know what I mean?
And the first thing that comes to my mind is that, and maybe I speak slightly out of turn, but the number of curators and directors with whom I've spoken, I feel have a real kind of introspection about the very construction of museums now. I think that it hit an incredible tension maybe some 10 years ago when or a tension that accompanied the explosion of the art audience, beyond its sort of circumspect, maybe microcosmic sense of the art world, so that what art could mean there and what it meant to dialogue with a broader culture, became a question, and then infrastructurally it becomes a question. Okay, how do you implement that?
I think that Nancy's incredible idea of blue is something that's a case in point there. I mean, how you would structure an exhibition around a formal attribute, and yet take that formal attribute and translate it into not only throughout the history of art, but also in its metaphorical meanings to everyone. No?
It's trying to find that balance between, we are in the business of aesthetics, to use an old word, not wanting to lose sight of that. I mean, in my own practice, that's deeply important. But how do you balance that with social relevance and engagement? It's interesting. Again, I'm so new at the Brooklyn Museum. When I look at the numbers, and it's something that I think Arnold did to both a fault and to his credit. On the first Saturdays, which are the performance, music...
Those are enormously popular, right?
13,000...
Yeah, it's incredible.
20,000 visitors, which is kind of terrifying.
What are they coming for, Nancy? I was
They're
wondering.
coming for community. They're coming, it's free. They're coming because they feel it's welcoming and it's a home. So, my question is, okay, when you get those people there, what do you do? And how do you advance the narrative of the museum? It's not just a party space. So that I don't have an answer yet, but it's something that I'm, unlike the Guggenheim, which of course is for a very long time was my beloved home, it's a very different experience of who's coming in through the front door, and trying to think about how to channel that. But then on that other level of trying to engage, and we're not the only museum, but with thought leaders in different fields, is where can the arts intersect? How can culture be a lens to advance other conversations? And it's a question: can we? Does it matter? Do we have anything to add? Certainly, artists are thinking along these lines. Artists who are engaged with social practice, many artists working with performance that go out into the community. They're really trying to tackle problems.
And the Kitchen was is an organization that was based. I mean, you're free. You're based on that premise that. You were started by two video artists, right? So you began with TV, in a way.
Yeah. No, one of the things that attracted me immediately was how so many of the potential anxieties around art today was actually baked into the history of the place, with its relationship with mass and popular culture, with its interdisciplinarity, an understanding of performance being in relation with other disciplines, an understanding, and this came up with Cai a few times today, both in conversation and in video, how everything is a time-based medium to some degree, and you're grappling with that, brings all kinds of potential, not only for aesthetic objects, but the way in which you create a public sphere or dialogue with the public in general.
Would the public like to join in this conversation? Does anybody have a question for? Mm-hmm.
We have a microphone.
Here, is that okay?
I guess my concern is there are a lot of artists in the audience, because I've been talking to people, myself included, and I guess I'm really disappointed that the opening commentaries and a lot of the reference points have gone to the Venice Biennale, which is really a political hobnob and has very little to do with the artists of the country. And I don't know how many people know that. I'm very disappointed. I was actually invited to Venice with the UAE for their first year in 2010, and the government decided that they wouldn't let any of the artists be exhibited because they wanted to show off the new buildings that were going to be built, which have still not been completed. So I guess my point is, I'm not quite sure how that benefits the artist, because I thought the initial content with the film was sort of sweet about being an artist and the struggle and the different ups and downs. So I wanted to bring that out to the audience, that the Biennale is a political pick by the government as to who they want to represent it, and really has very little to do with artistic ability. So that's my one comment. My second comment is with regard to the museums. I just wish you would open up more to how you're going to bring in new talent and what the process is, rather than putting up a label and then filling in that label. Because artists don't paint to labels. So that's my disappointment and also my question. And forget the Biennale.
How do you bring in new artists?
Now, how do we approach
Is that a
this?
question?
What?
Is that a question?
I don't know. The
Where's
second
the
part, I guess,
question?
was a question about if I could translate, and correct me if I'm wrong, the institution like a museum. You mentioned the museum, so you're off the hook, my friend. As a platform for new talent. In other words, the notion of opening is opening to a broader spectrum of artists rather than the nationally appointed kinds. Does that sum it up a little bit more? I mean, I'm not on the panel, I'm just the moderator, but I work at MoMA, so I might have to...
Yeah, maybe you should
toss
start.
it to you.
Why don't you-
It's all yours.
Yeah.
I mean, there's different models. Certainly the MoMA Project Room has been, over the years, one that is a designated space for younger, if not emerging talent, and has been, enormously successful in terms of looking back as who exhibited in that context.
I just had a thought, though. I'm not going to let you off the hook because I did. Because in fact, the efflorescence of the not-for-profit spaces, which was a result of began with under the Johnson administration, when the money started trickling into the states and cities.
Emphasis on trickling.
Yes, exactly. Emphasis on trickle, but places like the kitchen. When was the kitchen? 70?
Formalized in 73.
73. So between something like 1971 and 1979, there were many, many not-for-profit spaces that blossomed, especially in places like New York City, and they were platforms for emerging artists and also the kind of artistic expression that didn't have a home in a museum. The kitchen, in fact, was, am I right in saying that this was founded upon the premise that you were in a museum? Or what's that? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine museums, it would be, to answer, I'm tempted to talk about how the character of the museum has changed over time, but...
It's true, it's old-fashioned, and back in the day language I'm using.
Yeah, but I would say absolutely the kitchen was understood not to be a museum kind of organization. I do think the founders, the Veselkas, who were video artists, have gone on the record saying, well, it was supposed to be a video place, but all the other artists had nowhere to show, and so they were sort of foisted upon us, and we had no choice but to take them in. It's still like that. But what's interesting when you look at the archives is exactly who was coming through the door at what time. And you would see Steve Reich one week, Joan Jonas the next, and so on. There could be, or Dara Birnbaum, and Louise Lawler, very short. I mean, that it was very short in that regard. There was like a real sort of turnover, and so I think that maybe in that particular, in those early days, production consisted as much of the conversation among artists as what was actually being put on the walls.
So the exhibitions were ephemeral, which made it the opposite of a museum, which was trying to create something, a bricks and mortar kind of history of art. Do you think, Nancy, that museums now, with our voracious interest in contemporary art across the board, are we colonizing the space of the not-for-profit?
I think I can only really answer the question because I don't know the answer, is that whether the role of the museum, and when I say museum, I'm thinking right now of an encyclopedic, city-funded, large, but also with my Guggenheim hat, is the museum, is it part of its responsibility being an agent of discovery? So is that where emerging talent, like right out of, without a gallery representation, or right out of the MFA crit, or is that the role of the museum, or is that the role of artist space, or a gallery system? And I really don't know, and it's something that we think about a great deal. I'm sure it's very frustrating to artists to try to understand what the selection process, or why somebody's shown and not another, and there's so many examples, whether it's the Matrix program, the Projects program, the
Artists in the Marketplace,
Migrateur of Hans-Ulrich Obrist in Paris, that was so prescient in terms, you look at the artists he worked with in 1990-91. It's an ongoing conversation that I don't, or kind of root of interrogation that I don't know the answer to right now.
Do we have another question from the audience or comment? It's hard to see because the lights are very bright.
So I was wondering, in terms of museums and nonprofit spaces, who are the audiences that you're trying to reach? When one speaks of the community, engaging the community, which communities?
Well, in Brooklyn, I was just looking at the statistics, and I have not memorized them, but it's 45% people of color. It's all of the immigrant communities. So this is a very specific case. Our question is how also to be international. So all of the tourists who flock to New York to go to Broadway, to go to MoMA, and then that will also come to Brooklyn. And how do we create a program that will speak to both? So I think the Brooklyn Museum is perhaps quite different than a number of the other institutions, but I can't speak for El Barrio or Queens or the Bronx, who of course have different constituencies. And when Tom Finkelpearl was in Queens, he had community organizers, and I'm sure Laura. So different institutions have different mandates internally for who their audiences are, but it's an ongoing question for us.
And it's very different.
And it's not static.
Than the kitchen. That's a real contrast in terms of your. Do you think about audience at all? I mean, does it matter? I'm just saying. I mean, that's not what your central focus is.
I love the story that when I did an interview for the job, one of the board members in the executive committee said, if you don't force me to walk out of one of your performances per year, then you're not doing your job. Which was a great thing to hear, and I failed miserably at it. I want to say a couple things about audience. Maybe I'll try to three quick things. One, that idea of production of conversation among artists. it really continues at the kitchen. And to some extent, especially with our lab, which is language, art, bodies, conversation and presentation series, it's with an understanding that if the complexion of the art is changing, then so is the audience. And it's part of the art is actually creating the audience for an art, understanding what that reciprocity is. Formally, it's shifting. If there's an ambiguity, there's necessarily one in who the audience is. Two, historically, there's actually an incredible atomization at the kitchen. Subsequent to its original sort of inception, where when I first got to the kitchen, it was sort of remarkable. One night you'd see there'd be music, the next night there'd be performance, the next night there'd be dance. Music people would see music, art people would see art, dance people would see dance. How do you get these people to come together when they don't necessarily have a living proximity anymore? And how do you make sure that the languages that are so amazing in one discipline and community actually reach others? And then, finally, is more in sort of maybe a community activism, sort of moving out beyond the circumscribed sphere of the art world, which you see in larger institutions. But I think as nonprofits look for a kind of counterpoint to what's happening and find a mission in this particular environment, that dialogue with. One, actually having a public sphere within art is pretty remarkable. Places where artists can actually talk with each other or know that there's somebody in the audience or that you've got critical mass of people who know what they're doing. But two, if there's a kind of disidentification happening in art that needs to sort of move beyond presentational modes or that institutional structure, then that's something that we can move into a general public. And I think for me, that's an unfinished project, but I think it's really important.
I think it's right and proper that we started with artists and that we end with the idea of artists. So thank you both. It's really great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.